Hey there, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Georgia Bar Media and Judiciary Conference. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsors who made it possible to put this conference on each year. Our next session is Elections in Modern Day America, Georgia style. Over the next hour and a half, we'll be interviewing 4 people with very different perspectives on the election. Brad Raffensperger, our Secretary of State, Representative Barry Fleming, the Chair of Special Committee on Election Integrity. And this is a side note to Peter Canfield. Representative Fleming is looking for the Zoom connection. So if Lenora and Peter could work on making sure that that gets resent to him, that'd be very helpful. And then Senator Jen Jordan with the Georgia Senate Committee on Special Judiciary. And finally, ending up our hour and a half, Andra Gillespie, who's the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute, Associate Professor of Political Science from Emory University. We have a lot of ground to cover, and I politely have asked our interviewees to keep their answers short and to the point. We're going to start with our Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, who I'll ask to start his video and audio now.
Okay.
Secretary, are you up?
Well, the host has disabled it says. So
let's see if we can get you re-enabled.
There
you
go.
are. Fabulous. With all technology, we can have some minor glitches. So,
fair enough.
And you're an engineer, you know how these things can happen. Folks can read your bio at the link posted in the chat, but I want to point out that you are indeed an engineer by training. In your old job, you gave a lot of attention to the tensile breaking strength of concrete and steel, and evaluating how much pressure can be placed on a cable perhaps before it breaks and a structure collapses. Certainly you understand also what damage stress can do. How close did we come in the US and in Georgia to stressing our electoral and democratic system to the point it might have broken?
Thank you for that question. You obviously have done great research because you're really in the weeds in my business, my construction business. So very good. Yes. Stress equals M over S. You'll learn that very soon. What's very interesting is our office has worked hard to make sure that we have honest and fair elections with the appropriate balance of accessibility and security. And we actually came through, contrary to the narrative and the disinformation campaign, we came through a successful and effective election in Georgia. If you look at what we were up against starting back in March with COVID, we were able to have 5 million Georgians vote in an election, vote absentee, vote 16 days of early voting, also on election day. And on election day, we accomplished something that was absolutely tremendous. The average wait time on the election day afternoon was under 3 minutes average time statewide.
So I'm going to get into the performance metrics, which there are many for you, but it's been stressful for you and your team, right? This has not been an easy process.
It's not been, because in effect, after the election, we'll let Senator Jordan opine on this, but Republicans were surprised with the results. And I think Democrats probably were too. But for them, it was easier to adjust up. For the Republican side, they had a lot to grapple with. And then immediately what began was that information and disinformation campaign. And daily, we were fighting the rumor whack-a-mole. As soon as we would knock down one rumor, another one would pop up. We knocked the next one down. And so
going back to my question about stress, how close do you think we came as a country to breaking that cable, breaking the structure?
I think that when push came to shove, the people that were called to stand up to be counted and stand on integrity, did stand on integrity. We have 159 county election directors. And some county election directors may have struggled a little bit, with their systems on election day, but I've never questioned their personal integrity. I've never questioned the personal integrity of the people that work in our office. And I said to myself that I'm going to stand on the truth and stand on that. And I think the other states fought hard to make sure that they stood on their integrity. And as long as we have integrity, the system is secure.
So let's go back and review the process a little bit for the year. You rolled out new voting technology. That's got to have been a big challenge. How did that go?
What great. Kathy Cox rolled out a statewide system in 2002, but she had till November. We were fighting a judge that said, you'll have it ready for the March presidential primary. And we were ready and had 2 weeks of early voting. And then COVID shut down the General Assembly, shut down voting, it shut down the entire nation. And that's then we had to, how do you vote in a pandemic? And we had a major switch, but we were ready to go for the presidential primary.
So what did you learn from the June primary?
Obviously, COVID threw a loop. Well, first of all, when you're shut down, you couldn't do any hands-on training with your poll workers. First off, the average age of poll workers coming into COVID, pre-COVID, was about 72 years old. With COVID, if you're age 50 or older, underlying health condition, you were advised by all health authorities to stay sheltered. And many of our very experienced poll workers stayed, rightfully so, stayed home and did not volunteer to be a poll worker. So we had to do a recruitment. We did the best we could. The counties did the best they could. But what the counties were not able to do was that hands-on training, and that you saw some glaring issues. Went about 5 counties in the June primary.
Now, you took some heat from your colleagues at the legislature for sending out absentee ballot request forms to every registered voter. What was your thinking about doing that? And could you see another moment where you or your successor would need to do that again?
If you had a situation, a health emergency like we had, the counties didn't have any staff in their offices. They were virtually decimated. So by the state taking on that issue of sending out absentee ballot request forms, we took that burden off the counties. They just had to then do the processing of the absentee ballot requests when they came in. Also, because we did that and we had a uniform process statewide, we got in front of all these groups, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, and other outside organizations that were going to be sending absentee ballot request forms to voters. As you saw in the fall, sometimes people got 5 or 6 or up to 10 of these. And if you sent back 5 per voter to a county, you would swamp the vote. As it is, some counties had an issue. So that was another issue that we got ahead of. It allowed us to have a uniform process statewide for all of our voters. And we believe it's the right decision based on being in a pandemic environment.
Going into 2020, did you imagine the general election unfolding as it did, getting so intense with so many of President Trump supporters, President Trump himself claiming election fraud? And even now, many Georgians continue to believe he won Georgia and the election was stolen. I have friends who strongly believe that today. Is it possible you missed evidence of fraud that would have thrown the election a different way in Georgia?
Well, it's a two-part question. One is if we would have had a normal election without the COVID, then we would not have, I believe, had all the questions about the results. Because as soon as you went into a COVID environment, which was going to then result in a lot of absentee ballots, the president immediately went into disparaging absentee ballots, confusing absentee ballots, which require an absentee ballot request form from the voter, to mail-in voting, where they send out live ballots. 2 totally different systems.
You've conducted audits of just shy of 5 million votes cast. Were there any substantive issues found anywhere?
No. That's the advantage of that. And that's why we had to pick a race as part of House Bill 316. We audited the presidential race, and we went one step further. We did a hand recount, and that verified the electronic count on election day.
So how many cases of fraud did you find in 2021 election cycle, and how many have been referred to for prosecution?
Right now, we've had older cases that we've been handling. We've had 200 cases come before us from several years. We're now into the 2020 cases. We had about 150 in that range, and we're still finishing up the investigations. We've sent some to the Attorney General's office for double voting, other situations, but none of them would be enough to overturn the results that we did have in the election.
So about 100 cases.
About 100, 150 cases, yes.
So that's more than I'd heard up until now.
And some of those were county election officials, technical errors. It was not every case was not a double vote or non-citizen voting, things like that. It was some of these are technical violations where the counties didn't give people the right voting card, things like that.
So if you were to summarize the general election and the Senate runoffs, were they, in your mind, well-run elections?
Yes, contrary to the myth that's been put out there, yes, they were well-run elections. The counties did a good job.
So putting on your Republican hat, to what do you attribute the president's loss in Georgia and then the loss of Georgia's two incumbent senators, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue?
Well, that gets into punditry, and they say I should always stay away from that. But if you just look at objectively at the numbers, President Trump got about 18,000, 19,000 less votes in the metro regions than Senator David Perdue. He got 33,000 votes less than all of his Republican congressmen got in their districts. And generally, our state reps and state senators outpolled President Trump by about 5 percentage points. And so it's just one of those issues. At the end of the day, he didn't have that broad-based support that some other officials did.
Now, you had a call from the president asking you to find 11,780 votes, suggesting you were taking a big risk by declaring Biden the winner. Now that you've had a little bit of time to reflect on that call, on the nature of that call, what perspective can you share?
That we made an accurate count of the votes that were cast, and we stand behind our results.
There's now a criminal investigation into by the Fulton DA into whether our former president attempted to influence the administration of the general election in Georgia. In your mind, is such an investigation justified, and will you cooperate with that investigation?
Of course, we'd cooperate with any investigation, but that gets into legal matters. I don't want to go too deep, but I do think at some point, Abraham Lincoln said it best after the Civil War, with malice toward none and charity towards all. And at some point, I think it'd be helpful to move on, and because the nation has a lot of other issues we still need to deal with. But we would work with any investigation.
So Mitch McConnell, in his pretty scathing speech after former President Trump was acquitted in the impeachment trial in the Senate, all but called for criminal prosecution. So what I'm hearing you saying is maybe criminal prosecution might not be in the best interest of the country.
What I'm really saying is that I'm an engineer, y'all are the lawyers, and I'll let you hash that out. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, one last question about the election, then we'll kind of get on to sort of looking to the future a wee bit. You, members of your staff, people who work closely with you, low-level poll workers, IT folks, family members received death threats during this election cycle. Are you still concerned about your personal safety and that of your family and co-workers?
I'm always cautious on where we are. Hopefully, tempers have cooled down, and I would encourage everyone to really dig into the facts. As my dad said, you can't believe everything you read, and you certainly can't believe everything you hear on social media.
So I'm going to share my screen now. Last August, let me take you back there, the RAND Corporation published a report called An Assessment of State Voting Processes, preparing for elections during a pandemic. And I hope you can see that they're popping on the screen. In it, it evaluated Georgia as one of 9 states that had a high level of preparedness and flexibility for dealing with the pandemic. In particular, this report, which was highly complimentary towards Georgia, cited Georgia's automatic voter registration, no excuse absentee voting, extended early voting as key ingredients in Georgia's ranking of preparedness. And indeed, by the general election, October 30th, more than 50% of the 7.2 million registered voters had cast their ballots early or absentee. We'd had enormously high voter turnout overall. So if I can lose that here, stop the share. To get to the question, proposed Senate Bill 69 would do away with automatic voter registration. Senate Bills 71 and 241 would eliminate no excuse absentee voting, although 241, there's an amendment being offered or suggested in the committee that we're not sure how that's going to turn out. If that happened, though, if those bills passed, it would impose some of the most restrictive absentee measures in the country. HB531 would sharply limit early voting as part of that. We're certainly going to discuss those proposed bills in detail with Representative Barry Fleming and Senator Jordan shortly. But as someone who's had to administer elections in Georgia, are you worried about how any of these proposed changes will affect the ability of the state to respond to future crises and/or dampen voter participation, which seems at a really high point right now?
Well, I think that's really important. For example, the opt-out system we have, voter registration with the Department of Driver Services, has shown to be very useful and effective, that we really can verify who the voter is. And that is very important, that we can verify citizenship, where do they live? And when they move throughout the state, then we can really update our voter roll. So that has been found to be very useful. Our 16 days of early voting, I think that people are happy with it. The counties are happy with it. The county has to be able to manage an election. So that's one of the things that we look at. I do want to make sure that what we need to work on now is make sure everyone has confidence in that. I do believe that a process of voter identification with the absentee ballot, so we truly know who that is. And we think that's already done. We did that over the summer with our online portal, because we asked for unique identifiers, your driver's license number. And if you don't have a driver's license, if you put on your last 4 digits of your social security number, that would actually capture 99.9% of all voters. So it's a seamless way of doing that is not going to place any undue burdens on voters and allows us to have that security, but also the accessibility that we've come to expect.
Now, are you saying that needs to be changed or implemented further? Are you taking something that you've already done and saying that needs to be modified?
Yeah,
what do you
correct. The online portal that we put in the middle of the year is something we did through State Election Board emergency rules. And so now that those have expired, but that is the concept we've talked to many in the General Assembly, is that the Department of Driver Services, your driver's license number is a unique identifier. It's relatively easy to use. You just put that down inside the outer envelope. Many states have done that, such as Minnesota and also Utah, I believe, and we can get you all the states. But it's been used.
I think Barry Fleming's Bill 531 does just that.
Yes.
Would it be possible to adjust resources so counties could deal with the number of absentee ballots by allowing them to process those ballots earlier? Are there rules changes there for the counties that need to take place?
Yes, actually the State Election Board, we passed emergency rules. The first election in June, we said you can or you may process the ballots 1 week earlier. And what we found is that some of them didn't do that. So when we started in November, we said you may process 2 weeks earlier, but you shall process 1 week sooner. And we think that that could be codified in a House Senate bill. And we think that would be very useful because that would then get the counties up to speed so we're not sitting and waiting several days. And that's one of the areas that creates that lack of confidence.
It's when the absentee ballots have to be counted after
Right.
election day, and
Yeah.
you're waiting around till Friday.
Yeah, do that scanning work earlier.
Let me share my screen again. In HB 531, there's a portion of the bill would, among many other things, it's a big omnibus bill with a lot of housekeeping issues and some fairly major changes to the election law, which Representative Fleming and I are going to talk about in depth here in a minute. But this bill would, among those many other things, ban funding, grants, or gifts from any other source other than the federal government, state of Georgia, or the municipality. You partnered with Georgia Voting Works, and a lot of big companies here in Georgia, AT&T, Cox, UPS, to get folks out there, 3,000 tech workers out there, to get those voter machines, making sure that they stayed up. We had plexiglass shields donated for use at polling places. Home Depot gave 9,000 of them. Gloves given, thermometers, drop boxes. You had an early voting is easy, unlike 2020 ad campaign led by Coca-Cola's creative team. Are you worried that that bill will take away your flexibility? Is it the right call to have the legislature to make such partnerships illegal?
Well, we worked closely with Betsy Armentrout, and we appreciate her work. It was really a grassroots effort on her part. I think with the sense from the bill there is that they want to make sure, and we would also to make sure that the counties are treated similar so that everyone gets something. And so that doesn't just get funneled to one or two counties, and so it gets dispersed throughout the entire state. So that would be
for example, the gifts that Fulton County got, and we'll go into this a little bit, the $6 million gift, or the ones DeKalb got, and Cobb and Gwinnett. Is that what you're talking about?
That really, yeah, to allow, in fact, the Secretary of State's office, we had several grant programs with the counties so that we could help, defray some of the costs of the absentee ballot boxes. But if you had a centralized state authority to make sure it just dispersed out there on a per capita basis, I think that is really what the General Assembly is intending to do with that bill.
So Senate Bill 89 would establish the position of a chief election assistance officer under the auspices of your office, but appointed by the state elections board, which you head, would give the assistance officer the power to investigate poor county performance and recommend dismissal of county election superintendents. Do you support the bill in its current form? Have you looked at that bill in detail?
I believe at the end of the day, what passes is that I believe that that someone needs to have the authority, and it really needs to be at a higher level that reports to the voters at the end of the day, to be able to replace a county election director or even a board if it does not fulfill its requirement to make sure that you have elections that are well run. For example, in Fulton County, it goes back to all the way 1993, the AJC was talking about all the election dysfunction. And I am the first Secretary of State to put them under a consent decree based on what happened in June. So we have a monitor there, but we now have the authority to replace an election director. In Florida, they gave the power to the governor to replace the election director, and they've made improvement in a couple of those problem child counties. Everyone in Georgia has a stake in all the counties being well run, and particularly when it's a large county.
Senate Bill 241 would ban you from entering into any of those consent agreements in election-related litigation without first obtaining the approval of the General Assembly through joint resolution. Thoughts about that one?
The Secretary of State's office has only entered into one consent decree, which was putting Fulton County on notice, and we have our monitor there. But if the misguided attempt of the General Assembly is due to what was called the settlement agreement that we had with the Democrat Party about signature match, I think that may be what it's called, but it was never a consent decree. It was a settlement agreement. But also, this office is as a Secretary of State, I'm a constitutional officer. I'm not appointed by anyone. I'm elected by the people of Georgia. And therefore, we have constitutionally our constitutional powers. And I don't believe that there's any need for that.
Isn't that legislative approval suggestion requirement just going to irritate federal judges who will then be inclined to just issue an order without any negotiation when it really comes down to it?
Well,
don't tick off a judge.
At the end of the day, things get passed. In fact, I was up to, I think we're up to about 14 lawsuits somewhere early in my term. And so we kept on fighting those. And those are like the lawsuit whack-a-moles, and we fought those. But if a judge makes a ruling and you do not have it and you lose on appeal, then that effect becomes your state law. And so it doesn't require anyone to get together and say whether they agree, because you cannot, there are authorities that we answer to that are higher than ourselves, and federal judges, appeal judges, and our Supreme Court in Georgia, and I'll be respectful of every ruling that comes down. We may not agree with it, we'll fight it then, but when there's a final agreement or a final judgment, we have to abide by the law. We are a constitutional republic.
There are a lot of Republicans who still feel you should have done more to protect President Trump and the two Republican senators. You don't seem like the kind of person who would waver under political pressure, but it's not a pleasant thing to go through, what you've gone through. Have you decided, given the hassles, given the death threats, the criticism, whether you'll seek a second term?
Yes, I plan to. I think that at the end of the day, I think all Georgians want honest and fair elections. And I think they would like to see the appropriate balance between accessibility and security. And I'll fight hard for that.
As a journalist, I always like to ask one final question. What should I have asked you that I did not?
You're very good as a journalist, and so you asked every question you needed to. But I think at the end of the day, to circle back, people want to know that you got an honest referee. My job isn't to win elections for people or to hurt people that are running for office. My job is to make sure that I am a referee that just does my job.
Secretary Raffensperger, thank you so much for talking to us today. I really enjoyed getting to know you a little bit. And I welcome you now to hang around as we move on. Representative Fleming, I understand you're on the call, and we're delighted to have you. If you'll turn on your camera and audio. There you are. Excellent.
How's that?
It's perfect. It's great to see you. You've had a very busy week. You're a lawyer by training, and so I'm pleased to let you know, Representative Fleming, that you'll be picking up an hour of CLE for this session. So think of this as multitasking.
Well, I didn't know there'd be a bonus, Richard.
You're in your 9th year of service of the legislature, representing Columbia County.
15.
You're highly respected in the Republican leadership. You've been majority whip. You're been most recently tasked with the job of being chair of the House Special Committee on Election Integrity. Not sure on that whether to congratulate you or offer condolences, because that's been a really tough assignment. Why has it been so tough?
Well, in the state of Georgia, we've had close elections now for 2 general elections in a row. In 2018, we had a very close race for governor. In 2020, we had a very close race for senator and president. In 2018, we had a candidate that lost for governor who never conceded because she said the election system didn't work well. In fact, sometimes is referred to as governor, and she smiles. So that was very controversial. We now have an election that occurred in 2020 that was also very close. And we all know, because that's so recent in our memories, of some of the controversies there. So we have two general elections in Georgia in a row where there seems to be a lack of confidence in the election system. So the challenge for the legislature is to see what kind of changes we can make in our election system to try to increase that public confidence. Because if one thing we probably know going forward in Georgia, we're going to have close elections again.
So we're going to take us and the audience through 531 and also sidebars into some of the Senate legislation. But I want to point out something that you wrote right after the election, a very powerful op-ed for the Augusta Chronicle analyzing the outcome of the election, in which you correctly pointed out that there had been no down ballot blue wave nationally. And you made this point: Democrats are relying on the always suspect absentee balloting process to inch ahead in Georgia and other close states. If elections were like coastal cities, absentee balloting would be the shady part of town down near the docks you do not want to wander into, because the chance of being shanghaied is significant. Expect the Georgia legislature to address that in our next session in January. Is HB 531 going to clean up the docks?
Yes, and it does of in-person voting. In Georgia, I believe it is the legislator's preference that people vote in person. That's the best way. When you're in the confines of the precinct, there are election officials there who are watching to make sure that there is no possibility of undue influence. When that ballot leaves and goes outside those confines, you always have the chance of undue influence. We have a lot of rules in place to try to keep that from happening, but there are no guarantees. And for someone who has observed elections for years, the shenanigans seem to take place quite often with the absentee balloting process. There are court cases in Georgia where people have been found basically guilty of voter manipulation. So these problems do occur, and therefore I think we should have a preference toward in-person voting.
Okay, so let's go through. Whoops, we got a Amber Alert hitting here. Let's go through your bill here. I'm going to share screen. I'm going to start off with a provision relating to the, let's see, this is the clause that prohibits outside gifts or grants for funding. Let's see if I skipped ahead. Yeah, there it is. And I want to show, I can share that. Can everybody see that? So there have been quite a lot of gifts given in the 2020 election cycle. Georgia Voting Works, Center for Tech and Civic Life, Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, $6 million to Fulton County, 4.2 to Gwinnett, 5.6 to Cobb, 5.6. Those are million, by the way, that's million. 300,000 to Doherty, 421 to Muskogee, and then Arnold Schwarzenegger gave a bunch of money. What's the committee's thinking on banning donations for election support? What's your thinking on that?
Well, Richard, on your screen there is georgiavotingworks.org. Tell me who their donors are.
Well, they're large corporations. I showed that actually at the beginning of the last part of the session with Secretary of State. Let me see if I can pull that back up. Home Depot, Coca-Cola, they are large Georgia corporations.
There are no outside corporations outside of Georgia that made those donations?
Well, I can pull up the list that is there.
And also Center for Tech and Civic Life. You have Zuckerberg and Chan. Anybody else besides those people made any contributions to those funds?
Well, we know that they were the major funders to those groups.
But we don't know who.
The point is, they gave a lot of money to those counties, right?
And my
point is, money.
My point is, you don't know who else gave money there, and this is my point following that. When you don't know who's funding to influence the voting process, it is not a good thing for citizens to build confidence. Public elections probably should be funded with public dollars. Anytime a gift is given, it probably should go through an appropriations process, whether it be a county process or a state process. So once again, our attempt is to build confidence in the system. And when you have accusation of who is giving money to buy the things that are going on in an election process, you probably create some doubt.
Well, let me put the PowerPoint back up here. I can share that, and let me move on to some of the other provisions in the bill. It would allow poll workers to vote, who work in adjoining counties to work Fulton, DeKalb, swapping around. That's streamlining, make it easy for counties. Counties will be required to break up precincts with more than 2,000 voters with a history of more than an hour to vote. And there's also a measure that would block use of mobile voting stations used in emergencies only, and only to supplement existing precincts, not unlike Senate Bill 241. Why is that change needed?
The last one you just discussed, Richard?
Yeah.
So if you look at the current Georgia code and you try to understand the intent of why we allow other facilities other than voting precincts to be used on election day, you'll see that it was intended for in case a tornado hit and wiped out a church or a recreation center that was used as a precinct. That was the intent behind that. It was not that you could roll up a bus and move it around to different locations. People need to know where the voting precincts are. They need to know what time they're open, and you don't need to create the suspicion that you can roll around and take it to the places where you prefer to try to round up voters. Once again, an attempt to build more confidence in the system.
Now, Fulton County has used that a lot relating to souls to the polls and the churches. It also went to corporations. I remember voting outside Turner one year. And it's been over at Coca-Cola, for example. But they're looking at that and seeing that as you're targeting a particular group. You have a response to that?
If you don't have any voting mobile locations, you can't be accused of targeting any specific group. If you know where the precincts are in advance, and counties can open them whenever they want to, you don't get into that problem.
Absentee ballot applications would prohibit government entities from sending out unsolicited absentee ballot forms.
Yes.
Why is this change needed? And also private entities have got to put big labels on the absentee ballot requests. Why is that change? Why are these two changes needed?
Richard, one of the most common complaints we legislators heard from our constituents was that I received 7 or 8 different absentee ballots. Now, in most of those instances, we believe very strongly they did not, but they did receive 7 or 8 different absentee ballot applications. So one thing that House Bill 531 does is it says that governments will not send out unsolicited absentee ballot applications. We can't ban private groups from doing that because of First Amendment issues, but we want the public to know 2 things. Number one, who this is coming from, that this is not from your local board of elections or the Secretary of State, thus the prominent notification of who it's from. And also we require that it be one standard government issue ballot. Another thing we saw in this election, particularly in groups supported by candidates on the left, they would send out absentee ballots that were applications already pre-filled. A lot of that information was wrong. It caused a lot of problems for the election directors to try to ferret through that bad information. So this is a chance, once again, to get towards standardization to make the whole system work better. Now,
I'm not wanting you to defend a Senate bill that you had nothing to do with, but SB 241, they're asking that you swear an oath. You've got to be absent from the precinct for election day and all of early voting. So essentially doing away with no excuse voting. do you see this kind of stringent rule passing on the House side? I should note
Probably
that
not.
Senator Brian Strickland tried to offer an amendment this morning to do away with the restrictions on no excuse voting, but it'll be Monday before that gets decided in the committee. But just trying to get your wisdom, is this going to pass in the House?
Well, you never know exactly what's going to happen till the game's over, and we have a 40-day session. We're almost in the middle. But my suspicion would be not in my bill.
Okay. Back to your bill. You have right now, instead of 180 days before an election, the request period will be 78 days for absentee ballots and a cutoff 11 days before the election. Very quickly, what's the thinking? Why the deadline tightening here?
Yes, the whole idea is, once again, uniformity in the system, letting the voters know when voting is occurring, and having more, I guess, awareness in the public. What is the use of having 180 days before an election, 6 months, half a year, to have people start sending in their applications for absentee ballots? You need to do that before the election begins. And 78 days is probably a pretty good time frame to do that. It also causes more, I guess, consistent system for the election workers to deal with, because now, instead of having a process for 6 months where they're dealing with taking care of absentee ballot applications, we're dealing with that much closer, I guess you would say, to the actual election process beginning.
And the cutoff 11 days before the election.
We had an election director from Houston County testify before our committee, and she said right now, the Friday before the Tuesday election, you can still send in an absentee ballot application. And she not have made this comment, but somebody on the committee said that's almost false advertising. And she said, yeah, you've got about a 0% chance of getting an absentee ballot application back. So what we did is we moved it back to a reasonable time, so citizens can actually expect that our law reflects the possibility of them being able to apply and getting their absentee ballot. If you wait till the Friday before, you need to do either early vote or come in person, because you're probably not going to get your absentee ballot, and we're fixing that problem in Georgia law.
Okay, so the next one is the ID requirements. And Secretary Raffensperger talked about what he did in his website. Doing away with the signature match, driver's license number, Georgia ID number. It closely follows Senate Bill 67, which has passed the Senate. Right now, your signature is enough and is compared with the signature on file from the registration. Is this enough of a security fix? There's a lot of Republicans who think that this doesn't go far enough.
Well, once again, the better form of voting is in person. And you're correct when you say security and absentee ballots, because it's a problem. But this is a big step in the right direction. Richard, do you know your driver's license number?
I can pull it out of my wallet and look pretty fast.
But you don't know what it is off the top of your head,
No,
like your
I
social
don't.
security number, do you? And that proves the point I'm about to make. People don't know what their driver's license number is because they never use it for anything. However, it is closely associated with 97% of Georgians that are registered to vote. So because you don't use that driver's license number, you don't put it on the web. It's not out there for people to steal. Hey, if I can get in your back pocket, Richard, I not only can take your driver's license and maybe steal your vote, I can get your credit cards, I can get your cash. So that's a bigger problem. However, if we tie absentee balloting to that driver's license number, the chances of somebody stealing your identity for the purpose of voting is probably pretty slim. It also moves from a type of subjective looking at a signature to an objective number that is almost a unique PIN number for me, you, and everybody else in Georgia.
Okay, so one thing I was thinking about, if you have an ill-motivated caregiver or family member fraudulently filling in an absentee ballot, it's a heck of a lot easier to do it with a driver's license number than try to fake a signature.
Richard, you never faked your parents' signature. I'm sure you didn't. And you know what? I never did either. But I've heard some kids got real good at it. So this whole concept that I can't fake a family member's signature, that just doesn't fly.
Okay. SB241 here. They're going to require a photocopy of the government issued ID. The now deleted from the bill is the witness signature. That was deleted this morning. Is that going to fly in the House? Requiring a photocopy?
I think many states do require that if someone assists you, is what I think of, that they do have a signature process. That is something that we have not discussed. If the Senate sends that over to us, we certainly will talk with them about it.
Mailing of absentee ballots. So counties will only be allowed to mail out absentee ballots between 29 and 25 days before the election, 22 days before.
Correct. This is very consistent. I'm sorry. This is very consistent with what we talked about before about when we allow people to apply. We want to take the voting to a time period where everybody knows voting is going on. This gets real close to when we begin in-person early voting in Georgia 3 weeks before the election. So we're putting the election period together rather than stretching it out over a long period of time. Also, better knowledge for citizens to focus when everybody's voting. When did you vote? Well, I voted yesterday. Well, I thought we couldn't early vote till next week. More consistency in the system.
Drop boxes limited to inside advanced voting locations, constant surveillance. Why not just allow election officials to take custody of ballots when they're dropped off at early voting locations? They're already sworn ballot custodians, right?
You just said what we're doing, Richard.
Okay. Uniformed and whoops, if I can get this to go here. Uniformed overseas vote and overseas voters will get a special ranked choice ballot in runoffs. The highest ranked of remaining candidates would get the vote. And am I understanding this right, that the secure electronic ballot delivery will be eliminated? Is that what I understand from the bill?
Well, what this part of the bill does, it gets rid of a 9-week runoff period in Georgia. As you're aware, only a minority of the states have runoffs. Georgia is one of them, along with Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina, I believe, and maybe a couple of others. But right now, because we have runoffs in Georgia, and we have to obviously allow overseas individuals to vote, what we're doing is going to a partial ranked choice system where your overseas voters can now tell us who their second choice would be in third and fourth runoff. That allows us to go back to the original Georgia law of having a 4-week runoff period, not a 9-week. We call this the let me have my Christmas back. This year we had elections during Christmas in Georgia. If we go back to our 4-week traditional runoff period, because we've taken care of getting absentee ballots back from overseas, we'll end it before Christmas.
Could ranked voting be on the horizon for everybody in Georgia instead of the runoff?
Not anytime soon, I think.
Serial numbers in SB62 would require high security paper, precinct and serial number to be printed on each ballot, absentee and in person. This passed out of the Senate's Ethics Committee this morning. And again, I don't want you to be put in the position of defending a bill that you had to had nothing to do with in another chamber. But thinking as a former investigative journalist, it would not be hard for the unscrupulous to compare voter lists with serial numbers from a precinct and figure out how people voted. Does that make you uneasy? Well,
the first point on there, security paper, is actually something that is in my bill. Technology has gotten to the point where you can print paper that is readily identifiable as coming from the correct source, for example, for ballot purposing. So if there is any attempt to use ballots which are not legitimate, the chances of them having that security paper gets less. So I think that is something that has a good idea. I do know other states do have ways of what we call chain of custody tracking absentee ballots. I'm very interested in those. These other two portions that you mentioned on Senate Bill 62, I'm not able to discuss because I haven't looked at them in detail.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here because we're covering a lot of ground. No food and drink. In one of the hearings, one of the elections superintendents, I guess, from South Georgia was asking you guys not to ban food and drink in line because of the heat. Why is it necessary to prohibit this?
Well, his comments were a little bit wrong, and your labeling is a little bit misleading. Not intended, but nonetheless, we don't ban anyone from receiving food or drink. There's just a limit of how close when they get to the polls you can do that. Once they get within about 150 foot of the polls, that's when they're there to vote. And if you want to talk to them and interact with them, you got to do it before you get to that area. So you can do all that as long as you're not so close to the polls.
So no Sunday voting in the advanced voting. Why?
That's incorrect. There is Sunday voting in the bill that we passed.
Oh, so was that a change from the bill as it dropped that was added in?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And so is it one Saturday, one Sunday?
2 Saturdays, excuse me, 1 Saturday, and you get a choice of a Saturday or a Sunday. So 2 weekend days total.
Okay.
The second Saturday, and then on the first weekend of early voting, you can choose Saturday or Sunday. Your county can.
And 9 a.m. to 5 a.m. extendable 7 to 7 on those advanced voting days.
That's correct.
Advanced voting locations. Main office of the Board of Registrars. Essentially no mobile voting buses. This is in the SB241 Senate bill. Let's move on to 531. Oh, the last key item in 531, no provisional ballots if people turn up with the wrong precinct. What's the rationale for enacting this ban?
Many voters in Georgia are being disenfranchised and are not being allowed to vote in what is commonly referred to as down ballot or local races right now because of I guess you'd say a loophole in our law that maybe is being exploited now. Right now in Georgia, if you happen to go to the wrong precinct, what used to happen rarely, the election workers simply send you to the right one on election day. But if you demand to stay there, they will let you vote a provisional ballot, and we haven't changed that. But what's happening, we're seeing now, is that where this may have happened a couple hundred times, say back in 2016, it happened thousands of times in the last elections we had. So I go in and I'm in the wrong precinct and I'm in the wrong district. I don't get to vote for my county commissioner. I don't get to vote for my state representative. I may get to vote for the top of the ticket people on the ballot. What we're trying to do is make people's votes count. And so we're telling them, anybody out there who's encouraging people to go to the wrong precincts, that is the wrong thing to do. You need to go to the right precinct on election day so that you can vote for everybody on the ballot. It also will cut down once again on the confusion and the problems at the polling place. We want there to be short lines that move fast. And when you get several people there who are in the wrong precinct and have to vote a provisional ballot, you cause the line to be much longer for the people behind them. That's right.
We just heard from Secretary Raffensperger that there were no meaningful issues with the Georgia election. Based on repeated claims by the president and some of his supporters that the election was stolen, there's enormous distrust among Republicans about the election. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit with Senator Jordan. Shouldn't part of the role of the Special Committee on Election Integrity be to make clear to the public what actually happened, to explode the myths, point out that no fraud occurred?
Our purpose is to instill confidence in the voters of Georgia and the election system going forward. There were significant problems in the election as far as perception was concerned going backwards. We know that. Polls
but that
show
was
that.
Perception, not reality, right?
Is there a difference, Richard?
You tell me.
You tell me. I mean, quite often perception is reality. And what we think the best way to fix any perceptions of problems in the past, and there were problems, there's no doubt about that. You heard the secretary say there's over 150 or something investigations going on. We had testimony in our committee of attempts of breaking Georgia law regarding the last election. We just don't know how widespread it was, but we know it happened. So our goal is to instill that confidence going forward so that you don't have 250,000 or 350,000 Georgians not vote in the next election because they didn't believe the system worked.
Is there a danger with the array of Republican bills moving towards passage that your party might overplay its hand a little bit here and effectively help with passage of a federal voting rights bill because people would point, look what they did in Georgia?
Well,
are you worried about that?
I think a Speaker of the House just said today when asked a similar question about something going on in Congress, we have enough issues to deal with. We're not going to take on their problems. I don't have confidence that the current Congress would do something unnecessary. But our goal in Georgia is to instill that confidence in the voters. And the House bill that you and I discussed, 531, will go a long way to doing that.
So last question. A lot of the changes your committee is recommending and the proposals from the Senate side reverse laws that were proposed and enacted by Republicans back in the 2005 session.
Name one for me, Richard, so I know what you're talking about.
Well, the expanded voting.
We're not changing the expanded voting, Richard.
The absentee ballots.
We're not changing the ability to vote with no excuse absentee ballot, Richard.
Well, I'm also talking about 241.
Okay,
So,
okay. Well, all right, you're referring to bills that not in the House, but several bills.
I'm referring to bills in the legislature. Nate Cohn with the New York Times Upshot recently made the case that Democrats gain no particular advantage from absentee voting, right? In fact, restrictions on absentee voting and timing of absentee votings would likely depress turnout from both parties. But given that traditional voting patterns in Georgia, he points out, are more likely advanced voting and absentee among Republicans, that long term after the pandemic, that these changes might actually hurt Republican turnout. How do you reassure Republican voters that this is not going to hurt their chances moving forward?
Because I'm not here to reassure just Republican voters that this is going to hurt their chances. We're here to reassure all of Georgia voters, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, that the changes we're making are common sense, designed to ensure confidence in the system. You can vote absentee in Georgia if you want to. I think it's better if you vote in person for all the reasons we've discussed, but we're not changing that. We're just trying to make some common sense adjustments to the system to make it run better. Our system was overwhelmed by the pandemic, as was many things in our society. It was never designed to deal with 25 or 30% absentee ballots. We're trying to accommodate that, make changes so it'll work better in the future. And in my opinion, it would be better if we got down to the single digits and absentee ballots. That's the way the system always worked. Pretty good for decades.
What should I have asked you that I have not?
I think you did a good job, Richard.
Flattery won't get you very far. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, Representative Fleming. You've taken a lot of time out from what I know is an incredibly busy schedule. I will ask you now to turn off your camera, and Senator Jen Jordan, if you would join us here. There you are. Thank you so much. Senator Jordan, I know you're itching to critique some of the voting law changes I just went through with Representative Barry Fleming. But I want to first point out this graphic here, if I can. Trust in elections by party. This poll from January 25th, national poll, Morning Consult, shows 82% of Democrats nationally have trust in the election process, but only a third of Republicans. That's a monumental trust gap. Don't the Republicans in the legislature have to do something to rebuild that trust?
No, I mean, what they need to be doing is to try to go to their constituents and go to the voters and try to disabuse them of some of the misinformation and conspiracy theories that have been pushed out. With respect to what Chairman Fleming was talking about, he said, is there a difference between perception and reality? And there absolutely is. There really is no reason to make a lot of these changes in the law that they're pushing. And any of the changes that you see, you can actually trace back to one of the conspiracy theories that was pushed at some point by the former president or his legal team or his supporters. So I think it's a little ridiculous to say, well, you know, voters don't trust the election because of lies that were told about the election. Ergo, we need to now change the laws so that they'll feel better about the election. That's not even rational. That does not make sense to me.
Well, let's for a moment look at Clarence Thomas, who wrote a dissent in the Pennsylvania mail-in voting case. He wrote, an election free from strong evidence of systemic fraud is not alone sufficient for election confidence. The decision to leave election law hidden beneath a shroud of doubt is baffling. By doing nothing, we invite further confusion and erosion of voter confidence. Our fellow citizens deserve better and expect more of us. Isn't that just what the Republicans are doing? They're trying to rebuild voter confidence by taking some form of action.
No, that's not what's happening. I'll tell you with respect to the elections in Georgia, especially in November and then in January, they were probably some of the best run elections that we've ever had in the state. And it was in large part because of the massive effort by the Secretary of State, by the local county election boards, by private corporations and individuals who, especially in light of COVID, did everything they could to try to make elections as safe as possible and as transparent as possible too. That's what's interesting about Georgia elections. We keep talking about transparency and the public needing to know and not shroud these election laws. Election laws are not shrouded. Everything is very clear. Right. And so when we talk about uniformity or changing laws to make them more uniform, it's already uniform. And so it's really just a tweak that people are making in response to some kind of complaint that was pushed by Trump and or his legal team. So it's one of those things. I don't know about other states, but I can tell you in Georgia, it is very transparent. It is working better than it's ever worked before. And I think that's the most amazing thing to me. I'm so glad that things really didn't go off the rails because we would still be in litigation today if that had happened. But because things were done, you know, so well and so cleanly and so transparently, at least we were able to move through a lot of those legal challenges pretty quickly in the courts.
A lot of the Republican focus in the legislature is on absentee voting. And I wanted to point out in the 9th District of North Carolina, they had to do a redo because of shenanigans involving absentee ballots. Isn't this some need to make sure the highest levels of security are applied to application for submission of and verification of absentee voters? You had somebody, a Republican operative, turning in hundreds of absentee ballots there in the North Carolina race.
Yeah, that was ballot harvesting, which is against the law here in Georgia. And we haven't had any credible allegations or instances of that, and definitely not any kind of widespread effort like we saw in North Carolina by the Republicans in that state. Look, With respect to mail-in ballots or absentee ballots, we can really look to the states that do an all mail-in program to see what the best practices are. Utah, for example, who's been doing it for over a decade, one of the things that they do is they do a signature match program, and they use software that actually analyzes the signature. And 90% of the time, they can tell if it's a match or not. If there's a question, that 10% gets pushed out, and a bipartisan panel sits down to determine whether or not there's a match. So it's one of those things where I wish we were looking at best practices in terms of states that actually have done it and things that work, versus kind of this knee-jerk reaction where we literally have over 70 election bills that have been filed thus far for this session alone. And so in all of them, make some kind of tweak, do something different to change the way we do elections in Georgia. And there's no evidence to back it up. There's no evidence to say, A, that it's justified, or B, that what they're suggesting is actually going to make anything better.
Let's look at HB531 and some of the bills that are coming out of your side of the chamber. We're going to zip through because we're tight on time, and I want to make sure that we get through to the key things that I know you care about. Let's start with the HB531 measure on corporate gifts or funding from outside, and big part of that was the Georgia Voting Works, where you had millions of dollars in donations. Don't gifts of this magnitude open the door to undue influence? Isn't there concern about that and how that plays out? And certainly Georgia Voting Works had name brand, beautiful Georgia corporations contributing, doing really helpful things. But shouldn't there be some sort of process for managing these in some way?
So, I just don't kind of understand. So they gave grants or money or gifts of PPE or the like that were really helpful and nonpartisan and helped the elections process. But somehow there may be some undue influence. I'm not exactly sure what the undue influence is. And to kind of back up with respect to something that Chairman Fleming said, he said, "Well, who do we know? Who makes up Georgia Voting Works, even though you've got them listed?" Or with respect to the other fund that gave a significant amount of grants in the state of Georgia. Even if we don't know every single person that has given to those particular C4 or C3 entities, we do know how the counties use that money very specifically. And with respect to that, all of that money was used to make elections safer and in a nonpartisan way. So the whole idea that this money is influencing something, I'm not sure exactly what the influence is other than trying to make sure that our elections are run better. But the one thing that I can say is that I wish we actually funded our county election boards at a higher level so they wouldn't have to necessarily lean in on these private corporations or entities giving grants.
Let's see here. Let's move on. The workers in large precincts broken up, mobile voting stations only in emergencies. Thoughts about any of those? We're just really fast.
The mobile voting station thing, that's just clearly directed at Fulton County. And so it's just a lot of these things, like I said, if some of the Republicans had a problem with something some of the large counties were doing, especially the large counties with a significant Democratic turnout, then they're wanting to do whatever they can to kind of pull that back and to make voting just a little bit harder.
Absentee ballot applications prevents government from sending out unsolicited absentee ballot applications. Can you live with this?
Look, I think what was interesting is the way that this started is it said that private entities couldn't, but because that's unconstitutional or had, constitutional infirmities, they had to flip it around and say, well, now we're not going to let governmental entities do it. I just think that this is silly. These applications have been sent out by governments or for private entities for years, and there's no reason to stop that now.
In your chamber, SB 241, and I saw you in the back of the room this morning, I think, at the hearing. There's now an amendment being offered by Brian Strickland that would do away with the doing away of no excuse voting, so would keep the status quo. Is this going to pass in the Senate, do you think? Given the fact that all but 3 Republicans co-signed on 241 to do away with no excuse voting, is that going to go through the House, the Senate?
My guess is that 241 is going to get passed. In what form, I'm not sure, but purportedly it represents the caucus position of the majority party, which is the Republicans in the Senate, and its sponsor is the majority leader. So I don't think that there's an issue of whether or not it'll get passed. The question is, what exactly is it going to have in it at the end of the day?
And so what's your prediction on no excuse voting, absentee voting?
I mean, I think that this is, in terms of how it is right now, I think that it's, there's no way for counties to even police this. I mean, how can you tell whether or not somebody's telling the truth when they send in an oath to say they're out of, the precinct on election day or whatever? I mean, there's no way to really check behind that. So it's unworkable. I am hopeful after hearing Senator Strickland that this part will be stripped from the bill.
Absentee ballot request deadline, 78 days before the election instead of 6 months, and cut off 11 days. Any thoughts on those?
There's no reason to restrict it from the 180 days. That's already kind of across the board. And especially in larger counties like Fulton, DeKalb, Gwinnett, Cobb, it actually is better for there to be a longer period of time to process the absentee ballot applications, as opposed to kind of constricting it to the time period when early voting's going on. And there's a lot going on in the office.
Absentee ballot ID requirements.
I think the Georgia driver's license number is fine. And by the way, I know mine by heart.
I won't ask you to recite it.
I mean, it's one of these things where I think that some of these are fine. I think we should have kept signature match. That was stripped from one of the bills that actually made it through. I think that actually is an additional security kind of element. I don't like the idea of a photocopy of a government issued ID being put into a ballot envelope. There's absolutely no protections with respect to consumer information. What are the elections offices supposed to do to that? I mean, they've got an obligation now to retain this documentation. So are they just going to keep all of these copies of IDs for individual voters? I mean, it is really just rife for abuse and for people to be able to steal identities.
And I noticed the witness signature is now being cut from 241.
It has been.
Mailing of absentee ballot by counties, the deadline tightened to 29 to 25 days before the election. And I meant to show this to Representative Fleming, but I just on Monday got a Christmas card mailed on the 22nd of December. Is this going to work?
I'm not sure. I think we've got bigger fish to fry with the post office. I mean, I think that what we're dealing with in terms of the Postal Service right now and the problems that we're having with delivery, I don't know if that's going to be the norm. I mean, this is something that really is affecting all sectors, legal. I mean, we used to think we could get something in 3 to 4 days. There's the mailbox rule. There's all kind of things under the law that imagine that when you put something in the mail that somebody should receive it within 3 to 4 days. So this is kind of a bigger issue that we're going to need to take care of on the federal level. And I think until we figure that out, changing the law just kind of willy-nilly just doesn't make sense.
The other things that I think we're going to want to talk about are drop boxes and elimination, basically putting the drop boxes inside the early voting stations. Thoughts on that?
They're limiting them to voting hours of absentee, of
Well,
advance.
what's wrong
voting.
with having somebody look and make sure that those nobody's messing with those drop boxes?
They're under constant surveillance now. I mean, they are subject to pretty significant security restrictions. I mean, 24-hour video is run. These are secure drop boxes. If you just put them into an advanced voting location inside, then somebody could just go advance vote. That doesn't make any sense. So, and only during advanced voting hours, again, then somebody could just advance vote. People like drop boxes, they're secure. There's no reason not to think that they are. And in fact, they're way more secure than any post office box that you could drop your absentee ballot in.
Serial numbers on the ballots. How do you feel about that?
I'm not sure if SB62 is going to go anywhere. I think that there are some problems with this, and particularly with the high security paper. There was something about a holographic element. I think that the pricing on that would probably be prohibitive for counties.
No food and drink.
This is just line warmers. This is literally people handing out water, handing out coffee, especially, again, in the larger population areas where folks were standing in line pretty significantly during the primary. Thank goodness by November, a lot of those kinks got worked out and nobody stood in line for more than 30 minutes. But it has been a significant problem in the past, and there's just no reason for this.
I mean, isn't there also the potential you could have an event and invite everybody over for food and drink and then go, let's all go down to the polling station now. Is that banned? That's not banned.
No, that's not banned. This literally is about, like I said, line warmers, that they come, they try to keep people warm, they give them coffee, they give them water. They're just trying to make sure that people stay in line, especially when they're waiting there longer than 1, 2, or 3 hours.
Now, you heard Barry Fleming say they've added Sunday advance voting into the 531 bill. So that's one day of Sunday advance voting or a Saturday, depending on the county. I guess, could we see a situation here where some counties dominated by one form of one party or another switches the voting day accordingly?
There is no reason for this. This is absolutely a targeted assault on the Souls to the Polls program, and there is not even a reason for this.
Well, so what's the counter to this? The legislature can set election rules, right? They can say.
The counter to this is not to change the law. It is already set out in statute. It isn't as if there isn't already a statute or a rule or a law addressing this. This is just tweaking with existing law, to try to cut off voting hours or limit them.
I need to wrap us up, but a key thing I'd like to get your thought about is, and this almost seems like an afterthought, if you don't go to the right precinct, you shouldn't get the chance to cast a ballot. Why would some Democrats think this is a big deal?
Well, it's a big deal because especially if you look at the fact that we're going into redistricting. I mean, our lines and all of that are going to be redrawn, and that's going to be confusing to a lot of people. And also secondarily, the way that we do balloting here, or how we arrange our voters, is by county. It's not necessarily by precinct. So to say that someone, because they go to the wrong precinct and cast a provisional ballot in the county that they live in, right, that they are entitled to cast a ballot in, that somehow that vote shouldn't count because of that, that doesn't make any sense, especially in light of the fact that we do have advanced voting where people do vote outside of their precincts, but in their counties.
I want to thank you so much for doing this analysis and going through, and I want to give us time now to talk to Andra Gillespie. Senator Jordan, thank you so very, very much.
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. And Andra Gillespie, you are a brilliant political scientist, deep thinker. You're an Emory professor. You run an institute at Emory. You've heard now these proposals in quite a bit of detail. Collectively, what do they represent to you in historic terms?
Well, they represent an ongoing struggle and contestation to make sure that everybody gets the right to be able to cast a fair vote. I think they reflect the fault lines that exist in our society today along partisan lines, along racial lines. I think as much as we would like to take them out of historic context, we can't take them out of historic context. And we have to look at sort of what the intent, what the timing is behind some of these proposals. And then we have to look at their potential effectiveness and other proposals that have gone into effect and see what their impact is. And we also have to look at not just impact, but we also have to look at intent, because there are ways that suppression could be intended, though not materialized. And then there are also ways that suppression could not be intended, but yet materialized. And both of them are merit addressing. So one, we need to address the actual effects, but then we also need to counter faulty intentions, misguided intentions, perhaps even malicious intentions where they emerge.
Sure, we talk a lot about suppression of Black votes, and this is in some ways is a bit of a stretch. But for Republicans, there's quite a few of them are thinking, look, we have to convince Republicans to return to the polls after what we've just been through, and that after the big lie, somehow that they have to prove that they have fixed the system, that now it is safe, please come back and vote. What's your thought about that?
So I want every Republican to turn out and vote in elections the same way. I want Democrats and independents and people who ascribe to other parties to turn out to vote. I think, one of the challenges of, the aftermath of the 2020 election is that there were a lot of rumors and misinformation that were spread. And I don't think that we should be changing policy because somebody decided that they were going to double and triple down on a lie that said that there were problems that didn't exist. So Secretary Raffensperger, could probably do this better than I can. But as a scientist, he knows that, when you set up systems, they aren't going to be 100% perfect, that you always have to have margins for error that are involved, but you can tell whether or not something, 99%, 99.9% works. And that's what our election system is. So our election isn't perfect. We're not in heaven. But on the other hand, it works pretty well. And so we shouldn't be borrowing trouble. I am grateful that as an American, our election system is largely fraud free. So I'm not going to go borrowing trouble or coming up with solutions that are looking for problems when they don't exist. And I understand, and I have collected the survey data, have seen other survey data that corroborates the fact that Republicans don't trust the system. One, I think we're responding too hastily, right? We need to see what people are thinking 6 months to a year from now, because people's emotions are still pretty high after the results of the 2020 election. But I sure as heck am not going to be reactive in making public policy based on stuff that was not true, that the legislators know wasn't true. And so I understand that perception matters. But perception also goes both ways. And so if you're making public policy based on stuff that we know pretty strongly isn't true, then there also is the other half of the constituency, and it's actually a little bit more than half of the constituency, that says that this is taking opportunity of, faulty playing to try to change rules for that look like, from a perception standpoint, are intended to game the other side. So, the best way that I would think about this, I was trying to come up with the right metaphor while everybody was talking, but I was thinking about cooking. And if I'm making a vat of soup and one of my family members comes in and they wave an unopened jar of salt over the pot, right? It doesn't make my soup salty. And so if I taste the soup and I'm like, don't taste too much salt here, I don't need to go in and, add more water, make it bigger to thin it out, add more vegetables to it to absorb the salt, right? The first thing I'm going to do is, after I see the specter of the salt, is to actually taste the soup to see if it has salt in it. And I think that that's what's going on here. So I don't think that every proposal is unreasonable, but it's being done in a context where we've had a president lie to us for 3 months. And then we have people almost start a riot behind the lie. And then now people are coming up with changes that look like they're just trying to make it harder for some people to vote as opposed to others. And the irony, the deep irony of this is that before Donald Trump came up with this strategy that didn't work in 2020, Republicans were slightly more likely to take advantage of vote by mail and absentee ballot voting. It was a perception that Republicans were actually slightly advantaged by actually using these types of advanced voting techniques. And a lot of the things that people saw happen this cycle could easily be fixed by other people adopting those practices as opposed to trying to shut them down.
So Georgia is becoming a much bigger state. A bigger population means there are more voters, and each vote cast counts for slightly less. There's a sociological term called dilution of interest, where individuals feel frustration because they have less influence in the larger group. They have less say on what's happening around them. Could this be a part of what we're seeing in Georgia?
Well, I wouldn't quite use dilution of interest. So when we look at political science models that try to predict a person's likelihood of turning out to vote, one of the factors that is included in there is a person's likelihood of being pivotal in the election. And so, and also whether or not they care about the election results. So if you think that an election is close, that's likely to drive up interests in the aggregate, and we're likely to see higher turnout. So one of the reasons why we saw higher turnout, in the fall election was that when people really cared about the election results, people had really strong opinions about the candidates. They saw stark contrast between them. And the perception that the election was close also probably contributed to higher voter turnout. It didn't necessarily advantage one party or the other. My colleague Alan Abramowitz just published something on the UVA Center for Politics blog where he notes that, states that had greater absentee ballot participation did see higher levels of turnout, but that didn't actually contribute to a significant change in terms of the overall vote. So, the things that will increase turnout the most are shoe leather politics. It's mobilization, right? It's making sure that you're telling people to vote. And so part of the reason why we saw higher turnout in this election was that there was a lot of money running around, and people used it to go tell people, particularly people who are not usually told to go vote. So we saw greater mobilization in communities of color, not just African American, but also Asian American and Hispanic communities, where they get less contact and they have lower turnout as a result of it. So I think that that's, what's going on. And yeah, the new normal is that Georgia is more diverse. And because it is more diverse and because race and partisanship correlate highly with one another, we're going to be looking at more competitive elections going forward. At least, while the partisan coalitions look the way that they do demographically. That's not guaranteed forever to be set in stone, but the response to close elections isn't and shouldn't be whichever side loses one election, if they're still in charge of the state legislature the next election, they should try to change all the rules to benefit their side. Like, that's not sustainable. It's also not ethical.
So given the tensions in the country following the election, the January 6th attack on the Capitol, legislation that Democrats say is specifically designed to make it harder for Democrats to vote, Republicans who feel disenfranchised at the moment following the election, the redistricting battles that will soon rage across the country. Do you see any narrowing of the partisan gulf that seems to have emerged over the most basic elements of worldview that you can just see it play out in our panel today? Do you see any narrowing of that gulf in the near future?
Sadly, not yet. And so I think that there's
and
a lot.
What would it take to narrow that gulf?
Well, okay, first it's going to take leadership. It's going to take courageous leadership. So I applaud Secretary Raffensperger for standing up to President Trump. It took a lot of patience to be on that last call with him where he was asking for just enough votes to be able to win the presidential election. And it took very methodically going through and countering every false point that President Trump made to try to say, sir, that's misinformation. That's not true. Here's what we actually found. It's going to take a lot to do that. And whoever steps up and does it should be prepared that they're going to encounter a lot of resistance from their co-partisans and maybe even co-leaders. And there may be people who might have to be willing to lose an election in order to stand up for the truth, but it has to start happening. And so there are people in the state who have been willing to stand up to the lie, but part of standing up to the lie is also resisting the urge to be immediately reactive to the situation and start to put forward policy proposals that in the short term look like, they help shore up one's reputation within their own party, might actually help the next election cycle. But I argue in the long run would actually be deleterious to actually even Republican turnout. And then the final thing that I would tell people to do is to use some of the lessons that we've learned from 2020 to actually come up with a best practices. So, there's been a lot of discussion about eliminating Sunday voting and souls to the polls. There's nothing stopping a conservative white congregation, of any variety stripe from organizing their own souls to the polls event, right? So you shouldn't get rid of souls to the polls or try to eliminate weekend voting just because you're mad that Black people decided that they would rent buses and put people on buses after church, right? Everybody can do that, right? There's no reason to eliminate it. And in fact, what you're also doing is taking an option away from people who don't have time to be able to get to an early voting location during the work week so that they have an opportunity to do this. We should be talking about expanding the polls. I mean, if we even think about why elections are set on Tuesdays, it was so farmers after the harvest could get to their polling locations and not miss church, right? So if we were making it easy for them to do this in the 18th century, then we need to update that for the 21st century and understand what voting looks like. I mean, and for the idea that, for early voting, I should only go to my local polling location, which, is not that far from where I live. But when the early voting location opened within walking distance of my house, especially during COVID when I was at home, right? What a joy it was to be able to walk down the street on a balmy day in October to be able to cast my ballot to vote. So, it was that efficiency of spreading it out over time that made us safe because we weren't all in the same place at the same time. And then it also made it easier to manage because you didn't have to stand in line. And so, I just think that people are playing fast and loose and being really kind of convenient with when they want to make voting easier. And I think we should be thinking about this in a broader, more nonpartisan view.
You've been absolutely terrific in putting this in perspective. Is there a question I should have asked you that I did not?
I think we pretty much, so you know what? One of the things that I did want to talk about today, one of the things that
we're over time.
So one thing, especially since President Carter kind of came out today and said, please stop using the Carter-Baker report. That, I think another important thing is that, many well-meaning and well-intentioned and Republicans I respect, have brought up the Carter-Baker report and the concerns about mail voting that were raised in 2005. And I think the important thing is that was in 2005. We've had more than 15 years of learning since then to understand that some of the concerns that were being raised then when voting by mail was still new, even on the West Coast, to know that those problems didn't materialize. And so we should all be willing to update and try to make sure that we're staying up on the latest research. And some of these things have been studied time and time again, and we're not seeing the problems that I think many people are imagining and fearing.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I know how busy you are too, so thank you.
Thank you.
I want to make sure that we tell our audience what's coming up next. The next session tomorrow at 11 a.m. is the pandemic and the Georgia courts, where we are, where we're headed. This is an all-star cast with Chief Judge Susan Edline being the host, with Chief Justice Melton and Justice LaGrua, with Chief Judge of the Henry Superior Court, Brian Amaro. So they're going to be talking about how we get juries back in courtrooms during the pandemic. After that session, we're doing one on Meeting the Moment, Racial Justice, Law Enforcement, and the Right to Protest, moderated by Cobb Commissioner Lisa Cupid. And at 4 o'clock, the media and our government and politics, discussion of media coverage of government and politics, moderated by Richard Belcher. Jim Galloway, the newly retired political reporter from the AJC, will be on that panel, along with Nicole Carr from WSB TV, Robin Kemp, the editor of the Clayton Crescent, filling a big journalism desert down there, and Matthew Osborne, the editor of the Northeast Georgia. So 3 terrific panels tomorrow. Check your email for the Zoom links, and thank everybody for being here today and participating. One last thing, as you are filling out your comment cards, don't forget to put a comment to Peter Canfield thanking him for his 28 years of service pulling this 30-year event together. Whether you like what we've done or hate it, please do thank Peter. Thank you, everybody. Good night.